Hey, welcome to this Friday's video. Tonight we are going to talk about the basic structure, the basic concept of tonal chords and progressions. The basic concept and some very simple systems to deal with that. There are tons of systems out there to try to deal with those concepts and try to make them understandable and relatable to somebody so that they can, find themselves using them as building blocks to start from or resolve back to create, compose, and improvise. Well, the issue comes we'll address progressions first of all. We're not going to talk about progressions too much. You can get online and talk about progressions all day long. Different type of progressions, different way to word that, and all kinds of things. The basic concept of the progression is just take a simple progression like a 1-4-5. You're taking a major scale, using the first major chord, the fourth interval major chord, and the fifth interval major chord, and somehow creating some type of revolving rhythmic structure that keeps repeating. It's a progression, and it's either repeating or it's not. The understanding of a progression can be two things. It can either be some kind of revolving progression for like some kind of verse or harmony, something, or it can be like a transition, like you're playing a 1-4-5 and then you go to like the second interval minor and the third interval minor, and it's just a 2-chord progression that leads to some other progression or back to the original progression you were starting with. A transition progression, some type of transition. The transition can just be, you can be playing that 1-4-5 and then just hit the second interval minor chord, hold it for a couple minutes, do some kind of some type of melody thing or vocal thing, and go right back into the progression you're doing before, or on to some type of chorus progression or something. That basically is the concept of the progression. We're not going to talk about that too much. Just understand the basic concept and try to relate it to the intervals of the system. Try to relate it back to whatever scale it's playing in, which normally is probably going to relate back to a major or minor scale, and borrowed chords, and we talked about that. Chords that are not tonal chords, that are not using the notes inside the scale that you're playing from. And which one, and the series of them and what they're doing. They're revolving. It's a one-time progression that follows some kind of, some kind of this chord, then that chord, and then it goes somewhere else, or it goes this chord, that chord, and repeats. Something like that. That's the basic concept of the progression. And you basically want to relate it to the scale so that you can visualize it better on the fretboard, what that progression is and how it relates to the scale and key you're working in. And the concept is that simple. There's nothing to get really, there's all kinds of different ones. People say this, that, the other thing about what progressions. Progressions come in handy when you start talking about different types of genres and what kind of progressions are they using. That's very simple to either get the sheet music or learn the basic rhythm patterns that are happening and relate it back, look at it on the fretboard and visualize what chords are they using. Well, are they do they have a habit of going out of key and coming back into key? Do they have a habit of using types of borrowed chords that are not in key but keep resolving back to the key that's underlying? So studying progressions can be I don't really recommend getting wrapped up too much in that unless you're studying some genre. Country, western, rock, reggae, funk, whatever, and trying to figure out what kind of progressions, if there's some type of pattern that they keep coming back to for that style of music, then you'd want to analyze the rhythmic progressions that may be intrinsic in emulating that style or genre. Otherwise, the progression basically is you're just relating what you're doing in relation to the key and interval system and scale system that we've already talked about. What chords are being used in what type of a progression? You're going one first chord to from the first interval major chord to the fourth interval major chord to the fifth interval major chord. Where are you going from that? That's the progression of chords and its relation to the scale. You might be going the first major chord to the diminished fifth diminished chord. and then it's going to the fourth interval major chord. And that would be describing the progression. It's that simple. Don't get it confusing in your mind that progressions are some really, complicated concept that has to be, learned. That's the basic concept and how to relate it to the scale or key that you're working from. So that's a very simple concept to understand. The next thing we want to talk about is tonal chords. When we're dealing with tonal chords, if you remember the last video we talked about scales, you have like the major scale, the first interval, second interval, third interval, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh interval. And we talked about the modes for them. But the concept is real simple, is what chords can be played at each one of those intervals using the notes in that scale. And that's very simple. Using the intervals that are in that scale and its relation to what note you put the first interval of the scale on, so that you can relate what notes would be in that key. And that will directly relate to the patterns we talked about when we were talking about modes, so that you can understand what chords can be played where in that key and what notes can be played using that scale as it's applied to any certain key. And this concept is that simple. It's not that complicated. Try to keep it that simple in your head so you don't get confused by a whole lot of other stuff, people wording things some way, or some, esoteric, theoretical wording of some type of progression using some kind of scale and some chord and how it relates, and it's some big old long word that, you're going, well, I don't understand that. Try to relate it back to this. And if you get confused, ask. Say, how does that relate? You're talking about that, and you're saying something that the I chord second to the inversion of something. How does that relate to the scale? Is that like what interval is that? What interval are you using from that scale and playing in what key using the root, say, from G or whatever? How does it relate to these basic principles? Where is it at? And is it tonal chords are using notes just in that scale and key, intervals in that scale and notes in that key? Or are you doing something else that would be looked at as a borrowed note or a borrowed tone? And sometimes in music they call them accidental. So they're not, normally don't accidentally use a chord or a note when you're writing or composing or improvising. It's because you wanted to, but that's the way they'll word it sometimes. So it's a very simple concept to understand, and I'm going to relate to you a very simple system so that you can quickly visualize the scale and what notes would be tonal notes and tonal chords playing those scales or playing in key, depending on where you might have moved the scale and set the root interval. And that concept is very simple. And you basically need to know three modes. From the sixth string, the first Ionian mode, the Dorian second mode, and the Phrygian third mode for that system to function for you to understand it. And I'll show you why. And it's not that much, and that way you never get confused by the progression thing or the tonal chord thing ever again, because you can very simply try to relate it right back to the basics and break it down to the basic concepts and structures and system that I'm going to show you, so that everything keep it as simple as possible, and you can learn on, big words all day long if you want to explain it, but, it's like try to keep it as simple as you can, to keep it, in your mind and be able to relate it to people simply and eloquently and in a way that's very easily relatable. So, and we're going to be using bar chords. You can do this with triads, inversions, and things like that also, but for the most part, we'll be looking at it from bar chords and some of the systems I had showed you in last Friday's video. So, for now, let's pull out a fretboard and let's take a look at the system to find the tonal chords and discuss that a little bit more. Okay, so now we have on the fretboard here, we have the C major scale, and we've we're using the interval degree system. We've placed the root interval on C, so that converts to the C major scale, using the notes that you see, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, back to C, one octave up. Those are the notes available in that key, playing that scale in that key. So, with that concept, we've talked about scales and intervals and modes and that kind of thing. So, the first concept we need to understand is that what we want to do when we're talking about tonal chords, we want to know what chords that we can play from each interval. So if I'm on C, the first interval, this is the Ionian mode, what chords can I play from that interval? Or if I go to the Dorian, the D second interval, what chords can I play from there? What chords can I play using this as the root interval, the fourth as the root interval, the fifth as the root interval, the sixth as the root interval, and the seventh as the root interval? What chords can I play to be in key using that scale? What chords can I play? What tonal chords are available to be playing in key? And if anything else would be a borrowed chord or some of the abstract theory concepts we talked about that aren't using tonal chords from that scale or key. So that's a very simple concept to get into your head. So how do we do that? Well, you can sit around and learn this for all kinds of different scales. And we'll take a look at one other scale when I get done here to kind of relate that to you so you can see that. But let's just deal with the major scale and the C scale, or this in the key of C, and just relate that really quick. So instead of just learning all these chords, the primary chords you want to understand is from the first interval, it's a major chord, so you'd play major. From the second interval, it'd be a minor chord. Third interval, it'd be a minor chord. Fourth interval, it would be a major chord. Fifth interval, it'd be a major chord. Sixth interval, it'd be a minor chord. Seventh interval, it'd be a half diminished. Okay, so that's very simple concept to understand the basic major minor chord, tonal chords for the major scale and the pattern that goes there. Okay, that's a very simple concept to get in your head. And if you want to relate that back to the minor chord, it's the same chords from those roots, but you go 3/2 steps down and you're basically in A minor, which is basically the same key as C major. Does that make sense? But the major or minor chords that'll be from each one of those intervals is the same. See, on A here, this would be a minor chord. On B here, that would be the half diminished. From C, it would be a major chord. From D, it would be a minor chord. E would be a minor chord. F would be a major chord. G would be a major chord. And then you'd be back to A. And that would be the tonal progression playing in any minor key. Does that make sense? The tonal chord progression from those intervals. Because if it was a minor, this would be the first interval, that would be the second interval, this would be the third interval, that would be the fourth, this would be the fifth, this would be the sixth, and that would be the seventh interval playing in a minor key. Does that using the minor scale? Then we talked about that with scales, but that would be the progression of the basic major and minor chords for those intervals. Now, anything else above that, or if you're dealing with any other exotic key, this is a system that can really help you. We talked about basic modes, so let's just kind of go over that again and review that to understand this. So that you've got the Ionian mode from C using C as the first interval. And the mode is going to go from the first finger. I try to teach it this way initially to learn the 7 modes so you can improvise around on the fretboard and to visualize this system. Because you go C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G again, A, B, C, D, and E. This is going back to the root here. There's a couple other notes above it. So you have this pattern right here that is basically that Ionian mode. So now, and with the Dorian mode, it's going from the second interval, which would consider the first interval, you playing it from the mode, but it's actually the second interval playing the C major scale, if that makes sense. So you'd have D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, A, B, C, D up to D the root again, and then E, F, couple notes above that. So you'd have this pattern as that Dorian mode, starting from the second interval. Then we go to the Phrygian mode, which is from the third interval. You'd have E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, B again, C, D, E, F, and G. E back to this root again. So you'd have this pattern as that Phrygian mode. So with just those 3 modes, and starting them from the 6th string, setting up that scale from the first interval on 6th string so you can visualize the patterns there, now it's very easy to say, I'll show you this on the guitar fretboard, hold it in my hand when I get done here, but just like the major chord, you can see starting on this first interval playing the C major bar chord, you have C, G, C, E, G, and C. Does that make sense? If we look at it by degrees, you have the first interval, the fifth, the root again, the major third interval, the fifth, and the root. Now, from the first interval, starting on that first interval, those are tonal chord notes that can be played to create a chord there. So, very simply, they've created the major chord there off of that first interval. That's a tonal chord. Now, like if you're going to go to a major seventh or something like that, you'd have like root, fifth, seventh, major third, fifth, and first interval. And looking at it by name, you'd have those notes in it, because you're using that seventh with that chord. Now you've got a major basic chord with an added seventh that's making it a major seventh. And the concept is that simple. Try not to get it any more complicated in your head. Now you can look at this pattern in this area, and you can see very simply what notes are available and what intervals are available from that root to create chords. You could make a fourth, root to the fifth, to the root again, and using the fourth, and then using that fifth again, and that first interval, and you'd have basically the sus chord that we talked about that I had showed you. That's a possible tonal chord from the first interval. And that's the most simple way to deal with that. That way that you can visualize it on a fretboard like this and really be able to see what tonal chords you might be able to make that are going to be playing in key and using that scale. And you can do that from any interval. If I go up here to the fourth interval, you have on the fourth is major, the basic construct of major or minor is major on the fourth interval, so it'd be this root that would be the F. You'd have the C, the F, the A, and the C here. Correct? Would be a doubling of the fifth. But looking at it's a major chord. Now that's a possible chord to play there, right? So it's a tonal chord from this root. And so it's very easy to just visualize, once you've memorized that pattern, whether or not one of those notes are going to be in scale or key. Does that make sense? And we talked about how those two systems correlate together so that you can do this, move a scale around to playing different keys, from choosing different roots. So that concept's very simple. And if I go up here like to E or A, I see this first, and that's a minor interval, basic, major, or minor. So you'd have A, E, A, C, which is going to make it minor, because that's, if you go over here and change the degree, that's, you got, well, I'd have to change this thing so you could see it being a flat third, but basically that's a flat third, because you'd have the first interval, you'd have the fifth, you'd have an octave up, you'd have the flat third interval instead of the major third interval that would make it a major chord, and then you're back to this fifth. Correct? That concept's you remember that from the chordal structures in the last Friday night's video. So that's a very simple way that you can easily visualize all of the basic tonal chords from each one of the intervals from remembering the system like that. That way that you can very easily relate. You can see those three patterns from the three modes we talked about, the Ionian, the Dorian, and the Phrygian, and the basic patterns there are, so that if you play a minor chord here, you go to third interval and you play E, B, E, then you go to this flat third here, that's G, and you go to this fifth again, that's B and E. That's that basic minor bar chord. Well, and you can very quickly visualize what other chords are going to be tonal chords there, starting from that root. Correct? It's a very simple concept to get through your head. Does that make sense? That way you can really quickly visualize what notes you might be able to add in that area for using that Phrygian mode and remembering that pattern and setting up the scale there from the sixth string with the root there. What tonal chords, you can very quickly visualize what tonal chords can be played there. So you have to sit there and try to remember, a whole bunch of abstract tonal chords, because there's not that many of them. Does that make sense? But you can visualize really quickly what's happening there, so that the chordal structures we talked about, you can very quickly see if they'll apply from that interval. Does that make sense? If they're viable, if they're can be a tonal chord from that interval. And it's that simple. Try to keep it that simple in your head. One other concept is looking at it going the other way for like triads. So you have like, but with the triads, you'd have to also remember the Locrian mode and the Ionian mode, or the Aeolian mode. And I showed you the modes in those patterns. In the Aeolian mode, this pattern would be right here. And the Locrian mode would be this pattern right here, including that F there, would be the Locrian mode. So that's a little bit more, but I think you should know at least the initial mode patterns that I showed you. So you can go to D here, and if you want to play some kind of different chord, or say you're going from E. That first major, the major or minor significance of the third interval in the major scale is the third interval is minor. Major, minor, minor, right? So you've got a root, flat third, and a fifth is going to be the basic triad. So you got root, flat third, and fifth. If you go from the first interval and you look at it by degree, you've got root, major third, and fifth. So if you want to play kind of triadic chordal structures, meaning you start with a triad and then you build upon it from there, rather than doing bar chords, that you'd look at it that way. But then you'd have to learn a couple other different modes. You'd basically have to learn the Aeolian mode and the Locrian mode for sure to visualize in that system, because that's obviously going down into the Locrian mode and the Aeolian mode, correct? So that's a very simple concept to get in your head, and that's a really easy way for you to visualize tonal chords in any scalar pattern. Because we had talked about, and it's really simple, like if you go to, let's say we go to the, let's see, we're going to go to the harmonic minor scale. Okay, so the harmonic minor scale. Let's look at this. Let's go at this harmonic minor. I don't know if I can visualize it like that. So let's just look at the harmonic minor scale. Okay, so with the harmonic minor scale, the significance of that is that, well, let's go back to the major scale first of all, because if we go back to the major scale and we want to do this from a major, from the minor key of minor keys, so if you went from relative major to relative minor, that the patterns you'd have to, the modes that would be significant with just the basic structure and system, I thought it would be the Aeolian mode, the Locrian mode, and the Ionian mode. So you'd have to know these patterns. Aeolian mode, the Locrian mode, and the Ionian mode. But then you'd be doing the same thing. But it becomes a little different if you're dealing with some kind of abstract scale, like the harmonic minor scale. Because now you have to look at it as figure it out from the major perspective. So the harmonic minor scale is basically the harmonic scale seen from a minor key perspective. So you'd go 3/2 steps up, and harmonic scale is going to go root, second, third, fourth, augmented fifth, sixth, seventh, back to root. So the relative minor would be down here. So you'd have to look at it from here, and you'd have those modal patterns that you're trying to look at, because the Ionian would be here, correct? The Ionian mode would be there. The Dorian mode would be here, correct? And the Phrygian mode would be here, correct? Actually, we go all the way up to there. The Phrygian mode of the harmonic scale. That when we talked how it relates directly to the minor key significance. So then it's the same thing. Then you just take that pattern, you visualize it like that, and then you basically can see what tonal chords are going to be able to be played there. You very simply be able to really quickly look and see what chords from where. It's just like from here, this D, the Dorian mode in the second interval harmonic scale. That obviously it becomes real obvious real fast that the first one is diminished. So you've got this diminished one here, this augmented diminished fifth, so it's obviously going to be some type of diminished. And you can see immediately that you can immediately play, this can be with this root, augmented fifth or diminished fifth, and you're going to this flat seventh, and to this one here, that is a half diminished chord. So the half diminished chord is going to play there easily. Does that make sense? And you can see the diminished pattern here. So that concept becomes, with some other scales, you're going to might have to work at it a little bit to really understand the significance of what chords are. But by the time you get there, you understand this system with the major and minor keys really well, that by the time you really start messing around with that, you'll really understand that you will get a really good understanding of, like, this is the major scale from the root of C, which makes it the key of C, that the only difference is this fifth interval is augmented. Does that make sense? To an augmented fifth. The whole rest of the scale is the same. And if you look like a melodic scale, sometimes a lot in jazz, you'll notice that in the melodic scale, that it's going to be an augmented fourth and an augmented fifth. So if you come back down to the major scale, it's a real simple relation. Is this note here that is the fourth is augmented to the diminished, or to the augmented fourth, and the fifth is raised to the augmented fifth. Does that make sense? All the other notes are the same. So that concept's real simple to get in your head. And you can relate that directly to the minor significance of that. But I don't want to get into that too much. Some of that there can get deep, so I don't want to go there. I wanted to relate the major and minor significance of the major scale and the minor scale, the major and minor key using the major scale and the major scale system, and I want you to see about visualizing tonal chords. Now, if you start getting in some more advanced scales and you're trying to find tonal chords, now you know that you need to visualize it that way to very simply be able to relate what tonal chords are there. And if you find some stuff that's downloaded, you can find out whether that's BS or not, because you can visualize and go, well, no, that dude's saying that this chord is supposed to be in this scale, but I've got it written on the fretboard here and it doesn't work there. It's not using the tonal notes of that scale or key. So you can catch that. Does that make sense? And you can break it down to the basic structures real simple, so it's not something confusing. They start throwing some theoretical jargon at you that you just don't understand. And you're going, well, dude, can you speak to me like that in a real simple way that I can understand that, And I don't want to dumb it down, or something, but basically that can be true, because the better you understand it in a more simple way, the more easily you can understand when you run into people that just like to use big, huge words to theoretically talk about what they're trying to relate to you that you just don't care about, or you're not trying to study that hard theory. You don't really care what he's taught. You want to break it down into simpler theory. It's better to learn it that way anyway. That way, as you progress, that in your mind, it's broken down to much simpler concepts anyway. That way, the more advanced concepts and wording, the wordiness issue, that those concepts can be much more relatable, and you can very quickly relate them back to the basic concepts that we've been talking about in this series. So that's the tonal chord issue. That is a good system to help you work through it. And we talked about progressions, and that way when somebody's talking about tonal chords, it doesn't scare you. And we talked about you learning at least the major scales and the relative minor and the intervals and the modes that go with them anyway, so it shouldn't be that difficult for you to quickly be able to relate this system to the way I showed you the interval system, the scale system, the key system, the tonal chords that go with it, and or the chordal structures that are possible, and relating them to the tonal chord system and progression system. That way that you have a good basic understanding of what that means, and can always break it down to the basics rather than some wordy theoretical concept and verbal use of words. I don't know. I don't know how to word that. Some theoreticians get mad at me about that, because I was like, well, bro, why don't you just say like that? Because otherwise he's not going to even care what you're talking about. And, I think he's going to have to go to, Juilliard to have some understanding what the heck you're talking about. Break it down to a simpler way so he can understand that. Later, once he understands it, then you can go ahead and tell him that you've created some, 400 letter word to describe it. You know, so I know that sounds funny, but that can be very true for a lot of individuals that really don't want to get that advanced in the theory. They just want to understand the basics and then off they go, you know. I mean, they're not going to become theoreticians. Some of them will, and they go farther than that and they start really getting into that. Well, don't worry. There's plenty of people out there that'll talk to them and they got big, huge words for everything, you know, and ways to articulate things, you know, to relate issues and concepts to each other. But at least know the basics, you know, before, so you got a good solid foundation as you go into that arena, you know, because some of them are very articulate about it and they will, you can get confused. You don't understand how to relate that back to the basic system that they're trying to talk about. Does that make sense? So that's the system I wanted to relate to you and the structures you need to understand. And I wanted to talk about the tonal chord system today, what that is, how that relates to key and the scales that we talk about, and how to find them. A good simple way to find them that's a very simple structural concept that you can visualize very easily on a fretboard or on a piece of paper as you're noodling around, as you're improvising, as you're composing, you know, as any of those arenas that you can very quickly get back to seeing it on the interval system, the scale system, the key system, and be able to figure out what's going on there and or what is the next step in your creation and how to relate that very basic into basic theoretical structures and concepts so that you at least know what you're working with and where you're going. Depending, you know, because one of the big concepts of that is that understanding the tonal chords and these structures and the system I'm talking about, that anytime you go out of it and you use like a chord starting from the augmented fourth interval or diminished fifth interval, that you know you've left key. You know, and you might create some weird chord there that sounds really cool after you've played that D minor, that you played that D minor and you do this little finger picking thing and all of a sudden you go, it sounds really cool going to this diminished fifth interval and you've made up some chord there, you know, or you've put some chord there, chordal structure that we've talked about that sounds really good there, but it's not in key and you know it's not in key. That way it can help you resolve back into key. And it's always a good idea to start from in key. That's the way that at least that, like, you know, that you have some home base to get to or start from. The basic, that's what the music theory was all written about anyway. So you have a starting point and you have a place to resolve back to that sounds consonant, you know. So I always, a lot of times come back to that home base theory thing, and that resolve issue becomes way more important in a lot of creations and improvisations. So I hope you enjoyed this video on progressions and tonal chords. If you have any questions or I made something sound way too clinical or, you know, you feel like you're in Juilliard, what are you talking about, bro? You know, it's like, you know, let me know because I'm trying to break this down so that, you know, I don't care if you work at the Bob's Garage and you're turning a wrench all day, that I'm not trying to send you to Juilliard that you think you got to be in college, you know, for 12 years to be able to play some guitar, have some fun, make some cool songs, you know, and be able to relate back to these simple structures so that you can have more fun playing the guitar. Peace, hope, love. I hope this helps you become a better musician, a better guitarist, and have more fun in the process. Peace, hope, love. See you in next Friday's video when we talk about articulations.